Welcome back to the Intelligent Teams podcast, formerly known as the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we bring the sciences of mind into dialogue with practical wisdom to help you build high-performing intelligent teams. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy being a subscriber to the Intelligent Teams Substack. To receive a free weekly article or podcast with explorations of teams and cognitive science complete with tools and tips, go to intelligentteams.substack.com and click subscribe. This week's guest on the podcast is behavioural consultant, coach and neuroscience master's student, Ceri Newton-Sargunar. Welcome, Ceri, to Intelligent Teams.
Hello, Daniel. It's lovely to be with you.
Lovely to have you here. If you wouldn't mind, could you share with our audience a few words about who you are and what you do?
So, my name is Ceri, and thank you for pronouncing my impossible name well. That's always a delight. I am a consultant and coach, mentor, trainer, teacher, all things in the space of behavioural science. My background is one of teaching and psychology, and now I like working with technical teams. My tagline is that I like to help your technical people become more peoply people. But one of the things that I really love doing is taking things that are complex and currently unavailable to people and making them simple, accessible, and using that to help people build better connections between themselves. And like helping people to think about the impact that they have rather than the impact that they intended to have, and help them look at the gap in between those things and do something about it if they want to. If it's not going where they want it to, then I'm there to help.
Can you give an example of one of those complex things that would be that you would visualise, or one of those unintended things that happens?
Yeah, well, so I think there's two different things there. So in terms of the complex, as you said, I'm studying masters in neuroscience. So one of the things that I really love doing is translating neuroscientific research into team working, into leadership, and helping people realise or understand how neuroscientific concepts, insights, models, training, research can help them do the things that they're there to do, but more effectively, stop getting in their own way. So yeah, that's one of the things that I really like doing. And in terms of the impact versus the intent, I think that shows up for pretty much everybody that I work with on a daily basis. I think it's a very human thing, right? There's the way that I intended to come across, and then there's the thing that you understood. They're not necessarily the same thing, and having some awareness of that can help me make better choices. Things like when I say a word, do you understand the same word that I meant, or do you have a different interpretation of that word? And helping people to see where those differences and those gaps might lie, helping people to understand the assumptions that they're making about the language that they're using, how that's landing, how that's impacting the teams around them. One of the best examples is in terms of communication. So leaders think that they've communicated something because they've sent it out in an email, or they've put it out in a memo. Something has been publicised, and because we've publicised something, that now means that everybody knows. And it can be quite a surprise, quite a shock to realise that actually only about 3 people read that email, and of those 3 people, 1 person actually processed what you said, and they don't really care about that because it's not relevant to what they're doing anyway, so they haven't even remembered that that's what you said. So having that conversation can be quite a shock, I think, to a lot of the leaders that I work with. But yeah, we improve that. We work on it. We get better.
So, like, practically speaking, what does that mean your job involves if you see something where you think there's an intent to communicate a certain thing go out, and I don't know, your radar goes off like, ooh, I think this thing is not going to be received in the way that it was intended. Where does Ceri fit in?
Well, so a lot of the time I'm brought in to observe exactly things like that. So I sit alongside leaders. It doesn't have to be, senior people, any kind of leader that's got a job to do and needs to bring people along with them. And just picking up on the reactions of people in the room. As a coach, one of the things that it's our job to do, is to notice how people are reacting in the moment, not to decide what that means. It's not for me to decide what a raised eyebrow or an intake of breath from you means, but to help people who are delivering a message to notice when they're having a reaction or getting a reaction for people, and to get them more familiar with asking about what that reaction is, so they start to build a picture of the people around them and understand when they're having the impact that they want to have on those people and when they're not. Because it's really hard if you're talking to somebody to actually take a step back from what you're saying and notice the way that the person that I'm speaking to is receiving it. So having someone alongside you to help call those things out, help draw your attention to things, but also to draw your attention to the ways that people responded and reacted afterwards. So I noticed that you said, for example, well, in my experience, all engineers are morons. And after that, there was a sharp intake of breath from Sarah, who's one of our senior engineers. And everything that Sarah said after that was quite terse compared to the way that Sarah normally speaks. And then, maybe you didn't notice that. You hadn't picked up on that at all and had carried on obliviously, but were then surprised when Sarah didn't immediately offer help on something that you were fully expecting her to be committed to. And then we'll look at that, because it's really easy, surprisingly easy to miss those things. I'm not suggesting going around calling people morons is normal. Like, usually the language is a lot more nuanced than that, and we don't realise that what we've just said could be taken as calling people idiots.
Yeah, it's more likely that Sarah is sitting there hearing that laden into something that that a leader might have said, or that someone from a different part of the organisation might have said, or you folks can be so unreliable, or things like that. And I've been in conversations like that where, as well, software engineers don't know how to speak English to normal people, right? Haha. And they sit there, perfectly adequate English speakers saying that was actually quite insulting.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. And the other one is when people call things easy or difficult. Oh, well, that's really easy, you should be able to knock that up. And the implicit suggestion that if you don't find that easy, then there's probably something wrong with you, and then being surprised when you get some pushback or a response. Yeah, absolutely. And people's reactions can be a lot stronger than the person who's putting that message out into the world, a lot stronger than they might expect, because they don't have a perspective of just how deeply that can impact someone. Because what you're doing when you say something like that is it's a shaming behaviour when you say, well, that's really easy, or you should be able to do that, or you don't know how to speak plain English. It's humiliating to hear that about yourself, and that then provokes an immensely strong emotional reaction. Actually, humiliation and shame are two of the emotions that provoke one of the most intense reactions. So to have that happen in a room, and it happens in such subtle, underhand ways that people don't realise that that's what they're doing, but the reaction is intense and long lasting, and can build up quite a lot of bitterness and resentment, especially if it's something that people are repeating over time without realising. And then what they think is happening is that people are being belligerent or disruptive or antagonistic, or trying to sabotage the project. But what's actually happening is those individuals are actually responding to shame and that sense of humiliation, without anybody in the room ever really realising that that's what's going on.
Yeah, and it's quite humiliation and shame are really strong. This isn't like, well, you undermined me a little bit, or like, oh, I felt humiliation and shame are some of the, most deep cutting, it can be traumatic experiences that we get as humans. And how do you bring that to what I assume are normally sort of hard-nosed business people, for whom the language of humiliation and shame and emotionally rich language like that may not be so available or familiar to them?
Yeah, so I think it's a slow journey. You can't just go in straight away with emotional language when it's not a part of people's everyday vocabulary, when it's not something that they normally think about. I normally begin with a much gentler conversation. So getting people used to the terminology that I'm going to start using, but beginning by asking them about their concerns and the risks that they foresee, what it is that they see happening around them. So getting them to show me the kind of language that they are familiar and comfortable with using. And then when I'm describing things back to them, that's how I can then incorporate their own terms, their own language, their own ways of framing things. So that, and that's, when I was talking about making the complex and the unfamiliar more familiar to people by using people's own language back to them and putting them in things in terms that they can access, then it means that you've already got a picture you've already got an idea of the picture that they've got in their heads, and you can then use that to build a bigger picture, to expand on the perspective that they currently hold, and from there you can then introduce new terminology, new words, and I do that quite a lot with metaphor. I love a metaphor. There's nothing quite so powerful as introducing somebody to an idea with some sort of metaphor that really gives them a physical response, an emotional response to the picture that you're trying to build. If I can get that person to feel what the person that they've impacted is feeling, I don't need to use words to describe the feeling. The metaphor and that feeling itself is enough, and that's then enough to provoke them to say, okay, well, that's not what I want here, and I can see how that's getting me that result, but that's not the result that I want, and that's not what I'm trying to do. So that then is a great opener to doing something a bit differently.
Yeah, because if you're trying to change, or I guess widen someone's perspective, or widen someone's perspectives, I don't just want you to think about the way you would see the world automatically, but also try and see that person's world and that person's world. These metaphors can be such an interesting... I mean, there's this whole idea of like all our language is metaphors.
Yes.
And there's like Lakoff and Johnson and metaphors we live by, I think. It's on the shelf somewhere. Whatever. And the idea that all our language and all of our speech it's really impossible to have a conversation like this. Our speech is laden with metaphors. Get
Yes.
it? Laden?
Yeah,
it's really like
yeah.
burdened by...
Yeah. Well, every single word that we've constructed comes from our physical landscape, our lived experience. The way that we translate that is to use tangible, concrete objects and experiences that we have around us, that we use our senses to translate the world into something that our brains can comprehend. Brains can't feel, fingers can. So to help brains create these complex, rich pictures of the world, you have to use that. And actually helping people to see that the language that they choose is what paints a picture in another person's head is, I would say, a vital step in helping people to change the way that they're approaching conversations in order to get different results. And I like doing that in the team sense. I know it's very popular, and people like Rory Sutherland do quite a lot of that in the advertising and the marketing space, but I think there's a huge amount of value in using that same approach in the teamwork and the collaborative bringing people together space. To me, that seems like a really great place to apply this wealth of knowledge of just how much impact language has and the pictures that we paint with our words.
Yeah, and it goes both ways, right? It's both from stop talking about this like this because it implies something that you don't want. Right? So if you always refer to work as easy, it has an implication, which is people that can't do it are stupid. And you may not mean that, or maybe you do mean that, but like stop meaning that. Or you can use it the other way, where you say, like, how would I choose to use language in a way, or metaphors, or to help widen the horizons of this team and help give them more options or more clarity or more togetherness. We are on this boat and we are just on the first voyage, and then we're going to like dock somewhere for a bit and re-resource ourselves and go back on the second leg of the voyage, whatever. These things can really bring people together and give them a sense of like orientation about where they are. You mentioned earlier like that there'll be certain terminology that you might use, and if you're working with a leader, you might sort of gently introduce them to that. What are some of the bits of terminology or some of the ideas that you like to bring in when you're working with teams?
So a lot of the work that I do, I suppose, is taking research in this interactive space. So bringing in models like one of the ones that I'm looking at a lot at the moment is SCARF by David Rock, and helping people to understand SCARF can be quite insightful, I think, for people, and helping people to understand when we talk about, so SCARF is status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness and fairness, and it's quite similar to in some ways to self-determination theory. So it's a similar model that sort of has some of the same factors. But so when we talk about status, what is it that we're talking about? What is it that we mean, and how are we seeing that show up? So I don't need to talk about the whole model. A leader has absolutely no interest whatsoever in hearing about SCARF, but what they do want to hear about is the impact of status on their people and how that's making people show up, the impact of certainty on their people, and how that's making people respond to the challenges and the problems that they're hearing about. So using those models, I'll talk about the elements of the model rather than sharing the model itself, but over time I'll start tying those concepts together and say, well, we've spoken about status before and you've started to see how that's having this impact and exactly where that's showing up. And now if we look at relatedness, talking about that concept of relatedness, what that means, how that's showing up, helping them to see that this connection between us and my understanding of how connected I am to you and how connected you are to me is central to my sense of well-being in the world and my ability to process change and to cope with anything that you're throwing at me. And the more disconnected I feel from you, the more of a struggle that would be. Well, then, so we can start to wrap those things in together. And when you've then got this picture of each of these elements, then I can start bringing in this idea, well, this is called SCARF by David Rock, and it's this model that has this handy acronym. Now that we've spoken about all of those things, I've given you an emotional connection to each of those elements. Now there's a tidy way to wrap it up. That would be the way that I would take people in. I find that starting with the model and going the other way around, it can be quite overwhelming because they've already got so much on their plate. They're not really going to be processing and taking in a whole model, but actually giving it to people a bite at a time is a much easier way to process, because then you can spend some time actually noticing where that's showing up, seeing what that looks like in practice. So over the next 3 days, let's look at all of the places that this challenge of certainty will be showing up. Let's look and make a note of where we see that having an impact on how people are responding, the questions people are asking, and what they're not saying, and then let's look at what we want to do as a result. So tying it in slowly, I think, is a much more effective way than throwing it at someone head on or straight away.
It also makes it clear to the person you're working with that you're not just seeing them as like a cut and paste problem. Mm-hmm. So if I know that I say a thing and you're like, oh, there's a thing called SCARF, it can really help you, and it's this and it's this and it's this and it happens that all of your problems fit into this predefined framework that I know, I don't necessarily feel very listened to. Whereas if I talk about a problem and you're like, there's a word for that, it's called autonomy. Like, okay, let's spend a bit of time with autonomy and then work it. Oh, by the way, this happens to map back to something, and that's been in my head the whole time. Ta-da. It allows me to feel like listened to and keep the relevant things. And it allows you to allow them to bring relevant stuff. It stops you. That sounds like it holds you back from bringing in things that.
Well, it stops me deciding stops me from deciding the best model that's going to fit them based on 1 or 2 conversations. I don't know that yet. We are immensely complex, rich beings, and whatever model I choose to introduce to them is still going to be wrong. Human behaviour is just a series of ever morphing, blurry, boundaried Venn diagrams, as our emotions, as our concepts. So every single model that I introduce to them will still be wrong, but by introducing concepts one at a time and then showing how they blur and how the boundaries are fuzzy and how they merge into other concepts, and then you can wrap it up in a model. But actually maybe scarf isn't the right one. Maybe actually what we should be talking about here is self-determination theory, in which case we can pursue that route. But we also have the option to go back to say, well, there's another model that's quite similar that covers this, this and this, and then we can bring those things together and start building this idea that this is a rich, complex picture that we're dealing with. It's not one dimensional or two dimensional, it's multifaceted. We are Machiavellian spin doctors with more facets than we can ever really be consciously aware of in the moment. And I think that's one of the things that I like bringing home to people. There's a lot of assumption that with things like personality tests, well, I'm an INTJ, therefore, I am these 4 letters. Well, you're about 1 billion letters all layered on top of each other. That's just the 4 that came to mind in that moment. And I'm not here to diss Myers-Briggs or any of those models. All of these things have value, have place, in terms of us trying to understand who it is that we show up as in different scenarios and different contexts. I think one of the hardest things is realizing just how broad and how extraordinary that range is and can be. We are different selves at work. I'm a different self with my grandparents. I'm a different self with my kids. I'm a different self on a Saturday morning. I'm a different self at 2:00 in the morning. All of these selves are all still me. I'm just choosing which ones are the most appropriate for any circumstance. And that's the work that I then like to do next with anybody that I work with, is thinking about all of this richness that you have within you, all of these multifaceted selves. Which are the most appropriate elements for these different situations that you find yourselves in? What are the facets that you're bringing right now that aren't helping you, and how can we change that perspective? How can we shift so that you're bringing the most productive, constructive elements to bear in any conversation that you find yourself in? How do we trigger that response, that behaviour, that thought process?
Yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about maps, as always, in the last few weeks, and the idea of like confusing the map and the territory.
Yeah.
So I look at a map of London, I go, oh, that's London. And we're like, no, it's not London. It's a representation. It's a way of showing you all the roads in London, or it's a way of showing you all the tourist sites in London, or it's a way of showing you all of the tube underground stops in London. This isn't London. The only thing that is London itself is all of London and all the people in it. But when we're trying to simplify things, we take certain elements and we magnify them, and we ignore all the other stuff, and we say this is a map. And maybe these the Myers-Briggses and the personality tests, and I don't know, maybe also the scarfs and the ways in which we try and make sense of the world, they necessarily exclude lots of the stuff, because there's infinite stuff, so you have to exclude some of it to make sense of anything. And then we say, well, maybe like scarf makes sense here, and that's a kind of map, and that is as useful as the London Underground map, in that it's as useful as, it depends what you're trying to do.
Yeah, it helps you if you're trying to get from A to B. But if I'm trying to get a hold of Seb in accounts, the tube map isn't going to help me. Actually, a telephone directory or a DM directory, that's what's going to help me in that instance. The map of London doesn't map human connections. It also doesn't map sewage pipes. Absolutely. Depending on the context, we need different maps.
And also this idea of like showing up with different selves is interesting. Like when you said, I could choose these selves to show up at work, I was wondering, to some extent, like the selves choose me. Like they show up, the ones that are interested in different bits, and the ones that have sort of different, archetypes or traits or things like that. And I don't know, like who's the I that chooses those? Maybe I'm like integrated in some way, but yeah, that's what came up when you said that.
I love this conversation. This is so back when I was training as a teacher, and I first got introduced to this concept working with. I was working part-time as a secretary in a hospital, and I got into a fascinating conversation with one of the doctors there, and he was telling me about this new research that had come out that that said that there's no such thing as free will, and that the brain fires up the mechanism for you to think that thought long before you are consciously aware of that thought existing, and long before you decide to act on that thought, or to say something in relation to that thought. And that process happens well before you have any awareness of it, which is endlessly fascinating to me. Is there really
not just subconsciously, but like pre-consciously, like, because I think I read this in Daniel Dennett, one of his books about mind. He goes into the research there where it's like you can sort of plug in the neurons to the neuron plugging machine, technical term, and your brain starts making the movement action long before you self-report the desire to move, and things like that. And there's ways of like showing it that sort of show like the order in which they happen, which and I love thinking about that in terms of a team setting, because like the analogy goes, well, just as I am sort of operated by my mind or something, or I'm operated by a combination of my body and my emotions and stuff that I have control over and also has control over me, and like between all those different things, this personality called Daniel emerges. I want to say something self-deprecating, like if you can call it a personality, but yeah, this thing called Daniel emerges. It's still a British podcast after all. We have to make fun of ourselves. It's obligatory. So too, don't get distracted. This takes us. We can talk about neurodiversity later. But just as I am,
both go down here. Yeah, keep going.
Out the rabbit hole. Just as I'm operated by all these different sort of elements between my body and the environment and my mind and all this stuff. Also, too, like a team is a sort of distributed organism that is operating out of a combination of like conscious things that people are aware of and choosing, and also like subconscious or pre-conscious or things that are completely out of their awareness. And the team doesn't know the ways in which like the scarf factors are impacting their decisions, but they are. And the team doesn't know the ways in which the cultural assumptions of their organization are like showing up to them in a way that might be different if they work somewhere else or in a different country, but they still are. And you've got to sort of take that into account when you're thinking, how does a team as an organism behave with the same way that I as an organism behave, like in some ways that I am aware of and in some ways that I'm totally unaware of. And part of the job is to like raise the awareness level. Or something like that.
It's a great exploration to be had there. What is a team? Is a team a being in of itself? Does a team have its own version of consciousness? Does it have, if it has a collective identity, then that's starting to verge into that space. And what is that personality of that team? What is that entity that we create as a result? Because a team is a system, an organisation is a system, and we operate as elements within it and don't fully understand the impact of our choices within that system. But yeah, exactly the same thing is happening within us as organisms as well. So, what can we learn? What can we learn from each of those systems about us as individuals, and what can we learn about us as a team?
And also, what can we learn from what can I as an individual learn from the way my team is behaving? Right, like I am a is it a micro or macrocosm? There's a team going on in me.
Microcosm is the small version. Yeah, macrocosm is.
So I guess I'm the microcosm of a team, or I'm a smaller version of a team going on, or something like that. Which brings us like. Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say there's this idea that within organisations, this idea of culture and the shaping of culture. And I can't remember where I read it, but someone made this claim that actually the culture between two organisations is far more different than the culture between two different countries. And I can see how that would be the case, because each of these organisations is made up of the individuals that are drawn towards that culture, that company, that direction of work, whatever that work might be, and that then forms the culture. So your organisation can have a personality and a type, and attract a personality and a type to which that kind of work and that kind of culture appeals much more so than there is national identity.
I wonder if you could talk about a person's internal culture, like, what's the culture inside Ceri? How do the different parts interact? Like, what things do they believe and use and do together that might be different from the internal culture of Daniel?
Yeah, but I think that's where we start to, when we step into this space of things like trying to deal with imposter phenomenon, or in dealing with our critical inner voice, or trying to live healthier lifestyles. I think that's what we're trying to do. We're recognising that actually some of my internal culture is actually pretty toxic, and I don't feel good in this space, and I want to do something about it. I think that's what we're trying to do there.
Yeah, I guess just as like an organisation can do harm as a result of the culture in it. So I don't know, like the post office or something. Like this is for people from the future who are listening to this. There's been this big scandal in UK politics about how the post office IT systems were failing, and this was making it look like lots of people were stealing from systems when they weren't, and they were victims of terrible miscarriages of justice. And then the post office's own managerial culture blamed those people and didn't look internally, and it caused loads of harm as this collective thing. And maybe like when I cause harm as an individual, or when someone else does, that's as a result of a misfiring of the internal culture of me, resulting in like this global action that is me harming someone or me being kind to someone or something like that. It's an expression of an emergent property between all the different parts, rather than like some essential governor called Daniel that's running all the stuff. Just like there was no one person who like made the post office scandal happen.
Yeah, it was a collection of decisions that all came to a head and all created this this build that then became an unstoppable snowball. Yeah. And you see that when we develop, bad habits and ways of responding to certain kinds of situations and emotional triggers that we then have in response to words or smells, or that's effectively the same thing, this snowballing effect of decisions that have led us to this point. No one element is to blame, it's all of these things coming together.
Double click on one of these points and ask you what made you want to go and study neuroscience?
Oh, all right. Well, so I used to be a teacher, and I had to stop teaching because I got meningitis. And then after I got meningitis, I then got encephalitis. So meningitis is inflammation and swelling of the meninges, and encephalitis is inflammation and swelling of your whole brain, which is fun. It's quite painful, and it leaves you with what I described at the time as clouds for brains afterwards. And I'd always had quite a busy brain before, had never linked that to ADHD, wasn't really aware of ADHD, hadn't come into my frame of reference, wasn't on my radar. But I noticed after I had meningitis that my behaviour changed, the ways that I was responding to things changed. So my emotional regulation took a dive bomb. Was pretty poor. My memory was hugely altered. But interestingly, there were, I would say, other elements where suddenly I found myself much more able to cope with things than I was before, more resilient to things than I had been previously, which I thought was fascinating. And so I started studying psychology first to try and understand what was going on, and learnt a whole load. But then I got meningitis again, and noticed an increase or a decrease in all of the things that I'd noticed an increase or a decrease in the time before, which just made me more curious. What on earth is going on here? This is really interesting. So what I didn't realise is that meningitis exacerbates ADHD. It enhances and beefs up all of your symptoms, which, again, really interesting. But so I wanted to understand what on earth was going on. Why was this change taking place, what was happening. And what better way to do that than to really hyper-focus in on a topic, and nothing says hyper-focus like a master's. So, I figured I was already reading about most of this stuff anyway. I was reading every book, every pop psych book that I could find. I was already reading books by neuroscientists. I was listening to a dozen different podcasts by neuroscientists. I was already reading academic papers, and part of me thought, well, if I'm going to do all of this, I might as well, it might make sense to get actually a qualification out of it. So, yeah, I thought I'd apply and give it a go. And they let me in. So they clearly thought the same thing. Yeah.
Like that as being a way of like, screw you, meningitis. You're going to give me bigger ADHD. I'm going to use it to learn about you. Haha.
I'm going to learn about you. I'm going to understand you, and still struggle. But
yeah, still have ADHD at the end.
Still have ADHD. Yeah.
Yeah. What? That's the first time I've heard that. What is the connection? Have you learned about the connection between meningitis and ADHD and what?
No.
Right.
No, I wish I had, because the trouble is, I guess ADHD means that I'm now learning about all of the other things that I find really interesting instead. So I've pursued many other rabbit holes and not quite got to that one yet. But I mean, it's in future modules, not the meningitis side of things, but the ADHD. We get to look at quite a lot of the so ADHD, ASD, schizophrenia. This whole section. There's lots of overlaps in that space. So I'm looking forward to getting there when I get there.
Yeah, and there's something you said earlier was you ended up having sort of exacerbated symptoms of ADHD as a result of the meningitis, and that meant that you got like worse at some things and better at some things. Interesting if you put so ASD, well, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and schizophrenia, all in the same sort of bucket as kind of disorders. And also these can be things that like help people be better at certain tasks, right? Like there's this whole idea of ADHD superpower or autism superpowers or things like that, which isn't to say that like that people don't suffer as a result of them, or that they don't like present as disorders or anything like that. I wouldn't want to imply that at all. But that there can be these flip sides or these trade-offs where whether my ADHD shows up as a disorder, as a problem, as a disease, or as a superpower, an asset, is largely contingent on the environment I'm in, maybe, or the problems that I'm trying to solve, or I don't know. Has that sort of shown up in the way it sounds like, enabling you to be better at studying rabbit holes and masters and things would be like an adaptive trait?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it is any of these conditions, and I don't always class it as a disability, but it is still very much a disability, sadly. I think it would be disingenuous for me to claim that it wasn't regularly a struggle. And similarly with ASD, it doesn't suddenly mean that life is wonderful because you've discovered how to use things or elements of these conditions to your advantage, but by understanding the ways that these things mean that I show up, it does mean that I can make a more informed choice about, I know, for example, that if I can find an emotional hook for something, then I can pursue that to a ridiculous end, which means that I then end up being remarkably well informed about really niche areas, which is great in terms of needing to write an assignment or complete an exam and to pass it. So if I can find that hook, then it's very easy for me to focus. Similarly, if I'm struggling to focus on something, I can understand that, that's because there's no dopamine here for me. There's nothing that I'm going to get back from this topic. So if I want to be able to focus on this, I need to find what it is about this that is in some way going to be rewarding. It also means that you hear things like, if you want to get things done, set yourself a timeline, put it in your calendar, and that'll mean that you'll then do it during that slot. Well, ADHD comes with quite a lot of additional reactance. So psychological reactance, this is when you push back against being told what to do. So knowing that, I now give myself not to-do lists. So I know that if I write it on my to-do list, those are the things that I'm not going to do. And instead I have a set of things in the back of my head that I know that I also need to do, but because they're not on my to-do list, I know that I'm much more likely to do those 3 or 4 or 5 things, and I'll just pick one of those. So I call it productive procrastination. So I'm not doing any of the things on that to-do list, I'll do one of these other things instead, and I deliberately set aside those things as, well, they're not going on the list, like, they can wait until later, but there's no way I'm doing anything on that list. So as long as there's nothing that is urgent or important that goes on that list, we're fine. As soon as I put something urgent or important on the list, though, because I do trip myself up sometimes because I have to write things down to remember them, so I have to be quite careful about where I write them down, where I put them, and if I put them on the list, then I'm sorry to whoever you were, but you're not going to get that email, which sucks for you. It also sucks for me, but the other 5 people that aren't on my list, they thank you for your sacrifice. Yeah.
You are the chosen one. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to do the thing you asked me to do, and
good.
I've sacrificed that. So yeah, you're the one. You're welcome. I respect you enough to not do the thing that you've asked me to do. But, what an honour. In terms of scheduling, I actually double booked over this. Because I had this in my calendar. I was like, great, then it's in. And then someone said, are you free tonight? And I looked at my calendar and I was like, yeah. Looking straight at the thing that was like, you're recording a podcast with Ceri this evening. And I respected that person enough to push them until later. Yeah, it's a funny one where like thank them for their service. Yes, thank you very much, my friend Sarah. Because there is this thing about I also not diagnosed with ADHD, but sort of identify with it, put myself on the pathway. A lot of it resonates with me and my experience, and I know that being distracted by all these different things can totally get in the way when there is something that you should be doing. But also being distracted by all these different things, it shakes the snow globe more often, and you end up like learning about lots of different things, or half doing certain, or finishing things that needed doing anyway because they kind of always needed doing, and it comes at the sacrifice or something like that. So there's this idea of the social model of disability, I think is what it's called, which is, something's a disability if the way that you are interacts with the environment in a way that makes life like extra hard than it would for someone else, which means that like if the environment were different, lots of things that we would currently consider to be disabilities wouldn't necessarily be considered Absolutely. Like that. And for a lot of ADHD feels like that when I think about interactions with, expectations at work.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wish that people would actually pay a lot more attention to this, because I think it shows up quite a lot in things like people's circadian rhythms as well. So as a species, we've evolved to have 2 sets of circadian rhythms. Some people like getting up in the morning. I don't understand those people, but all power to them. Whereas other people like me, 4 a.m. would be a very happy natural bedtime for me if I could get away with it, and I would quite happily sleep until sometime between 11 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and just have my day work that way around. And it makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective to have 2 groups of people able to forage / keep watch. It makes really good sense. Similarly, you need people who are really able to focus on getting something done to completion. If you've got to build something or you need to chase something, you need someone who's got that persistence. Similarly, it makes evolutionary sense to have people who are willing to let go, stand back, give up and stop pursuing so as to not waste energy. But it's having both of those things available to us that means that we are as successful as a species as we are. And attention to detail versus big picture thinking out loud versus internal processing. All of these ways of being have a benefit depending on the context, depending on the circumstance and the environment. It's just finding where is the right context, where is the right environment to really use this well. Things like I know that government services quite like to so the people, our friends in Cheltenham like to bring in people on the autistic spectrum, because as people with autistic spectrum disorder, we're able to see things in a different way. We're able to draw connections and look at a bigger picture in a way that neurotypical people just don't see. I constantly go through my day drawing connections and then describing them to people and being astounded that they haven't seen that or can't see that. The comment that I get back as often as anything else is, oh, well, I'd never thought of it that way. I'd never even seen that. And it's just that ability to take a step back and draw connections that other people just wouldn't, to put 2 and 2 together to get 17 in a way that other people wouldn't.
And vice versa. Those people could draw connections that you couldn't, right? And that, like, between the two of you, you have the perspective of that full thing. Yeah. I love that, like the circadian rhythm idea, and because the question is, like, if I show up in my life, at work, in any sort of environment, like, what's the unit of analysis? Like, what's the unit understudy here? And, like, our assumption in this thing called the West, or Christian informed societies, individualistic societies, is that the interesting thing is the individual. And then you have, if that's the case, like the individual is the starting point for society. You have all these questions like, how on earth do we survive with all our foibles and our weirdnesses? And, if you watch me, like, trying to, like, empty the dishwasher and doing 11 things at the same time, you're like, how does this creature survive? And the answer is because I'm surrounded by other kinds of people with other kinds of preferences who make that possible for me, and for whom I make that possible for them. And the interesting unit of study is, like, us as a collective. We've always been a collective species, and, like, we need this diversity. So when people say, like, we need to embrace neurodiversity, it's like, well, the fact that even needs saying shows that our starting point is completely wrong, and the way in which we think people should show up at work, like, oh, you need to, I don't know, maybe I need to manage my ADHD better so that I can be a better citizen. It's like, no, my team should be better set up for the fact that I have ADHD, and therefore, like, I will bring all the benefits of that, and it will make that less of a constraint for me being promoted or something, or for having my ideas listened to. Or as facilitators, we hold space in ways that fosters neurodiversity as across the whole spectrum of neurotypicals and neurodivergent people and all these and everything in between. We should make inclusion the starting point, and not set up spaces that are, like, well adapted for neurotypicals and that neurodivergent people have to squeeze themselves into or manage their condition for in order to thrive.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great things that Apple has come out quite recently and said that they're not reducing their inclusion and diversity policies, and they're keeping going with those despite the wishes of their shareholders. Apple, one of the most successful companies, one of the most innovative companies, and the reason that they're able to be so innovative, and this is the power of diversity. It's not some woke leftist hippie nonsense. Actually, when you think about it, it's got some really solid, secure capitalist undertones. We make more money when we share more perspective and have a better view of the landscape that we are operating within, and can see potential pitfalls and highlight those to each other and not fall down those holes. It makes really good engineering logic sense to me. It's astounding that people would think that this is hippie nonsense or woolly fluffy stuff. And I feel the same about behavioral science and behavioral change. And I think this is one of the reasons that I do well with people in the technical space. It can be seen as fluffy woolly stuff, but I don't see it that way. I see it as having a very clear link to your bottom line. And your bottom line will be better if you employ this stuff more effectively. Here is where it is not working. Here is where it could work better. And people are willing to buy into that. They can see the value in these technical, traditional STEM spaces. Where you wouldn't expect those sorts of concepts to be well received, really hierarchical, really traditional. But actually, when you put it in those terms of showing how it is impacting bottom line, how it is impacting delivery, how it can impact these things for the better, people are actually really willing to engage with these things, and that's to the benefit of everybody involved in the system.
Yeah, the phrase that comes up for me is like a win-win. Like, you can have a thing where by including people, by giving them clarity on where they are and are not included, by having clarity on like how power is used, by making more things more inclusive or being clear and democratic about the things that are not inclusive, right? Because this doesn't mean anarchy, everyone gets to decide everything. It means clarity. It means like grown-up discussion with people about which decisions you're going to make with them and which decisions you're going to make without them, and maybe seeing if we can decide these things together. And if you allow people to show up with whatever they think will help them in their job, and you optimize for those interactions being good and being like kind, honest, good old-fashioned values, sort of systems, people will be happier, they'll be more productive, you'll make more money or achieve whatever your goal is more. It's not everything going to be solved, but it's often presented as a trade-off. I often have jobs that are called things like agile coach or agile delivery person or these, and in those like technical spaces, sometimes it's like, well, this agile stuff is nice if we can do it, but if something really important comes up, we'll just fucking do it. To the point where if you say to someone JFDI, just fucking do it. We know what that means. It means like powerful person has told you what to do. And it's like, how do you get across to them that like, that's just a worse way of doing it. It's worse on pretty much all of the... It
just means we're going to make your mistakes bigger and quicker. More catastrophically, because you're stumbling through the forest blind rather than trying to work out where there might be bear traps. But sure, sure, we can do that if that's the way you want to operate. I think that's one of the delightful things in this space, is actually helping people to see that when you do have those conversations, just because I'm inviting more perspectives as a leader, that doesn't mean that I have to do what everybody says. I still get to make the decision about the direction that we go in. That's my responsibility. I don't give that away when I invite perspective. I just help people feel heard, which helps them feel happier, but also I learn things that I might not have learnt otherwise. And as long as there's no negative comeback on people for sharing that insight, they'll be more willing to share that insight again. And who knows what valuable things I might learn that I would not otherwise have known. And how can that do anything other than help? It's like saying, I want to walk through this forest and just pretend that there aren't pitfalls. I want to pretend there aren't bear traps. I'm going to leave all of the people that know where all of those holes are. I'm going to leave those all in the hut, and I'm going to stomp through this forest at great pace by myself because I can do this because I'm big and strong. Like, why on earth would you do that? That's just daft. Let's not do that. Unless
organizations
you often you want to break them, that's fine. Yeah.
In organizations, like maybe the equivalent is you don't put them in the hut, you like carry them in the bag, and as soon as you see yourself falling down the bear trap, you like throw one of these people that had the information down the bear trap that they knew about. Because often the leaders aren't suffering the results of their poor decisions, it's the teams. So they get both the disempowered of not being involved in the decision making, and they also like suffer the consequences of it.
Yeah. Although as leaders they still are, of course, because then there's there is shame and embarrassment associated with failed projects, which is why you then end up with people covering things over. And that's the reality of not listening to people, is actually you're just increasing your chances of being embarrassed. Yes, the comeback is less on you, but there is quite a lot of shame associated with being a senior leader with a failed project under your belt. I've worked with plenty of senior leaders who want the project to be a success, not because they care about the project or what the project is doing, but because their reputation is at stake, and it will impact what they go on to do next and how people see them in an organisation. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm here for it. If that's what helps you make better decisions that include people along the way and help people have a better working experience, like that is the win-win-win. I don't think that is a bad motive at all. Sure, let's go if that's what gets us.
It's really
all
natural.
Yeah. Why not?
It goes back into humiliation and shame, like we said earlier. Like the leaders can experience that as well.
Yeah. But also it goes back into learning how to use things like ADHD. Well, learning how to use my desire to avoid shame and humiliation. All of these things, none of these emotions or responses, none of them are good or bad. They're just appropriate for the circumstance and helpful, or inappropriate for the circumstance and unhelpful. And all we want to do really is be identifying which are the most helpful, appropriate responses for that circumstance that get the best result for everybody. And that has a net positive effect for everybody. And that's the impact. Not the intent.
I want to jump back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was you didn't get a chance to zoom in on ADHD and meningitis in your studies because you got distracted by all sorts of other interesting things. I was hoping you could share some of those other interesting things.
Oh, there's been so many. So most recently I've been looking at adult hippocampal neurogenesis. So this is the idea that later in life you still retain the ability to create new neurons. So it was previously believed that we are born with all of the neurons that we are ever going to have. And as a result, things like who I am and my ability and my intelligence, these are fixed traits, whereas actually what we are now understanding is that it is and the research is nuanced in this area, so I'm not going to come out and say that we definitely have the ability to generate new neurons, but the largest body of research seems to suggest that we keep this ability to generate new neurons throughout our lifetimes, which suggests that actually you can teach an old dog new tricks, you can learn new behaviours, you can learn new ways of being. It is the research suggests it's more difficult, it takes more effort, it takes more intent, it takes more of an emotional connection to help us remember things. But given that the new neurons that we generate are in the hippocampal region, so associated with memory and emotional and learning, it does suggest that by experiencing new emotional reactions to situations and information, we can remember things, and we can bring that to mind when we need to, in new novel circumstances and settings, which again makes evolutionary sense. When we go out exploring, we want to be able to learn the new pathway that leads us to a delicious fig tree and learn the pathway that leads us to a bear's lair, and avoid that one and seek out that one. So it makes sense that we would retain this ability. What else? I learnt about a fascinating study that I keep telling anybody who will listen about. And it was called From Jerusalem to Jericho, and it was around the importance of context and how that impacts how we show up. So what I was saying earlier about our Machiavellian multifaceted selves, it turns out that that is very true in terms of we have this idea of who we are. But actually we are different people in different settings. So in this study, they had groups of priests that were divided into 3 different camps. They were told, trainee priests, and they were told that they were going to give a talk, a 5-minute talk, and so they had to arrive, and on arrival in the centre where they were going to give the talk, they were put into one of 3 time conditions. So either on arrival, they were told that they were they were running late and that they needed to hurry over to the centre to give their talk, or they were told that they had enough time to make their way over as soon as they could, but to get there as quickly as they could. But they weren't late. Just the people on the other side were waiting, or they were told that they had plenty of time. There was no rush to get to where they needed to go. So then, on the way to the centre where they were giving the talk, they had to cross a courtyard with a path, with a bench, and there was a paid actor who had supposedly fallen down and was injured and needed help. And so the test is how many of these trainee priests stop to help this injured person. How many of them pick this person up? Now, trainee priests, you would imagine, are moral, good people. They're here to help. They're there for the good of the humanity of the world. What was fascinating was that the people in the hurry up time batch of test condition, they were the least likely to stop, and the people with plenty of time on their hands, they were the most likely to stop. Now, as a control, all of these priests were split into two conditions. Either they were giving a talk on what makes a good priest, or they were giving a talk on the Good Samaritan, which I think is delightful, because you can go into this setting with the intent of being a good person. You can go there to give a talk about the Good Samaritan, but if you're told that you're running late and there's social expectation on you in how you show up, it changes who you call to mind, how you see yourself in this setting, and can make you ignore all of those factors when you see someone who needs the Good Samaritan's help en route. I think that's absolutely crucial to understand when we are operating in an organisational sense. We like to see ourselves as good people. We like to see ourselves as moral, as guided by good intent. But actually, the setting in which we find ourselves triggers this, this neural response, this fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, and we will call to mind whichever one of those is most likely to see us through and to keep us safe in that setting, in that environment, without humility, without shame, without social repercussions, without embarrassment, and that's the route that we will pursue. And I found that fascinating and delightful, and I love sharing it because I work with a lot of people who think, well, this is how people should be, and it's nonsensical to them that people aren't doing what they expect people to do. But then when we look at the environment, the way that things are set up around people, we can see that we're actually triggering people to move in these behaviourally undesirable ways, simply because that's their best chance of staying safe in this setting. I don't know. What do you want to explore more there?
So many different things, because I'm thinking about it links back to what we were talking about with culture and the kind of place that this organisation is will constrain the kind of person that I am there. As in, if I'm in organisation A versus B, I will show up as a different person, and certain elements of my personality I'll find easier to bring, and certain I'll find harder, and that may be to the benefit or the detriment of either of those organisations, depending on the context as well. And again, it's that, what's the unit of analysis here? Is it like one perfect bound soul called Daniel who shows up kind of identical in any situation? Or is Daniel very different depending on what situation I'm in? And the cognitive science inspirations for this intelligent teams, agile on the mind type work is all the 4E cognitive science. The idea is that cognition is embodied and extended through our tools and our culture, and it's embedded in physical environments. And my cognition is not just happening in my brain, it's rather happening between me and my context, between me and my other people, between me and the culture that I operate in, and that's just completely coherent with, I think I've seen, I love that experiment because it's really vivid, isn't it? Going back to metaphors and stories and things from the beginning of our conversation, the idea of the priests talking about the Good Samaritan and sort of brushing past someone that's fallen over, it helps me remember it.
Yeah, you can see where it's showing up in that organisational sense as well. What I like about sharing that particular study is that it takes away some of the blame that can be thrown at people for behaving in certain ways. And as soon as you start to understand these behaviours as survival mechanisms, and you start to see how the system is prompting those survival mechanisms, and you start to understand how really with those prompts and with that environmental setup you are not going to be able to trigger any other kind of behaviour, it starts to open up a very different kind of conversation. It becomes less about us and them, those idiots that are acting in that stupid way despite what's obviously the right thing to do. And then you can start having a conversation about, well, how do we change that environment so that we elicit the behaviours that we want to see from people? If we're describing these as our set of values, but these are the things that we're doing that prompt people to act in ways that are counterintuitive or contradictory to those values, what do we need to do differently as an organisation, as a leadership team, as a manager of a group of people? What do I need to do differently to set people up for success in that space rather than setting them up for failure?
And it also gives more that I see that as like a tool for an individual as well, to say, I'm finding it hard in this place. Maybe this is not a place in which I am like going to be able to be happy as easily, or it would be harder for me to show up in the way that I would want to. And that's not because of me, and it's not necessarily because of like any one person there. Maybe there is, you've got an enemy or someone that is really causing a strife in an organization. But if you say, I'm struggling at work, when I show up at work, am a product of myself and the context that I'm in. Maybe this context isn't right for me, and it's not like a reflection on how good I am at my job or anything like that. It's just there's something in the chemistry between me and this place that that means that I bring a certain part of myself to work, and I don't like that part very much, and I don't want to keep bringing them back home to my family, so it's time to look elsewhere or something like that. And that's a much more empowering way of looking at it than, you should be good at your job, you should be able to survive in any role, and thrive, whatever, and be resilient and things like that, no matter the cost. Because sometimes organizations can't change. You could be a manager and see that someone that you're managing is not fitting in well with the culture of the place, and say, I really wish that this was the kind of place that could support you, and I'll do what I can, but also there's 10,000 people in this organization, and they're not going anywhere, there's a choice available.
But it's almost like an implanted organ that is now being rejected by the system. And this was what we were talking about earlier with the personality of the organisation. If you are such a mismatch, then it was never going to work anyway. It's really unfortunate for both sides, but it would not be able to function healthily anyway in that setting.
Which can be difficult for people in our profession, where our job can be to be difficult and to say unpopular things, or to be the grist in the mill, or the grit in the oyster, or to slow leaders down, or to use like Tobias Mayer's language, like, I don't know, prophetic or prophets or iconoclasts in an organization. Now maybe the iconoclasts end up getting thrown in jail or crucified or whatever. I think that's because a lot of us are horrendously uninformed when it comes to how to get people on board, how to present difficult facts to people, difficult information, difficult perspectives to people in a way that does not trigger a fight, flight, freeze or fawn response. If what you are presenting, if the person that you're presenting it to can see and believes and feels safe in hearing and receiving that information, because psychological safety is a factor for leadership, and whoever it is that we are sharing our truth with, it's a factor for them as well. If there's any risk of shame or embarrassment or humiliation to them in what we're presenting, especially if we do it in a public forum, they're likely to push back, and they're likely to respond with that nuclear response that we were talking about earlier. Whereas if we are presenting things to them in a way that they can see that there's benefit, that there's there's a win-win
for them in that, there's no reason for them to push back. And I think that quite a lot of us in this field would do very well to learn how to present information without triggering people. You want to present things that are a little bit uncomfortable, but by showing whoever it is that you're speaking to, by presenting it with compassion, with empathy, by understanding their needs as a human, by caring about them and the outcomes for them, rather than presenting that information to them as if they're the bad guy, the culprit, the person to blame for all of this. You are Dr. Evil in the centre of this maelstrom. Well, of course they're going to push back against that, and you're not going to get anywhere. Whereas showing them how this set of behaviours is a very normal set of behaviours that humans engage with. That doesn't make you a bad person, but I don't think that that's the intent, the impact that you're trying to have here. I see you more as trying to do this, this and this. If you steered in this direction instead, you'd get more of that result that you're seeking. Whereas this is me trying to show you that I think you've got great potential, but actually right now you're not getting what you want because of these things. I'm on your side. When we're presenting ourselves as that kind of challenger, my experience is that that is incredibly welcome. It's incredibly well received. The leaders that I've worked with, that the people around me have approached the conversation in that way, and I have approached the conversation in that way. People are grateful for that perspective and that insight, because you're there to help them. You're not there to hurt them. Whereas as soon as we give any indication that I'm there to hurt you, to show you up, to prove what an idiot you are, of course we've lost them. We're never going to get anywhere that way. It really hurts me. I feel really sad to see a lot of the people that I know, who are great people, who really know what they're talking about, end up in this space where they are getting kicked out of companies for saying things in such a way. And there's nothing wrong with what they're saying. It's just how they're presenting it to people. Everything is sales. You have to sell these ideas to people in a way that makes them realise that this is something to help them. And if you can do that, then people can hear really hard truths. I have sat down and, I sat down with a senior engineering leader, and at the end of the conversation, it was an hour and a half long conversation, he came out with a giant smile on his face. And he said, "That was brutal. Good brutal, but brutal." And that's the reaction that we want. But the only way that we do that is by caring about the people that we're speaking to, not just caring about the people that we're speaking to them about. There you go, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Really, that was a lovely soapbox, and I appreciated that a lot. This feels like a good place to start to draw us to a close. Is there anything that you were hoping we would cover or talk about that we haven't had a chance to bring up?
I've got about 50 million studies that I always could bring up and talk to people about, but no, I think...
Will you furnish us with just one, so that I don't leave my listeners feeling bereft?
Okay. So it's... I don't have the name of the study, but there's a psychologist... I think she's a psychologist, not a neuroscientist, but Tessa West, and she's done a lot of work around perspective getting. So there's this idea that we can understand how another person is feeling by putting ourselves in their shoes. Actually, as humans, we're really bad at doing that. We're terrible at reading facial expressions. We're terrible at predicting how someone else would feel in a specific circumstance, because we don't have the rich history that they bring to bear on the situation that they find themselves in. But so what she encourages instead is this idea of perspective getting. So going and asking people what it is that they think, what it is that they feel, and how they're doing in a particular struggle, or what is their perspective of a particular challenge, how they feel about you as an individual. It's what sits behind the 360 work, actually going and asking people how you're doing. And I just think it's an immensely powerful piece of work, simply because I think we're really good at trying to get perspective by imagining ourselves in other people's shoes, but we're not not often so brave as to go out and actually ask people. And actually, in the studies that she ran, in the experiments that she ran, people were asked to, the subjects of this study were asked to go and get feedback on topics that they were quite uncomfortable to get feedback on, and they were apprehensive about this feedback. They were asked to predict what they thought the feedback would be, and what they thought people would say. And actually, when they came back, they reported getting a huge amount of information that they never would have imagined existed. But also, surprisingly, that people were refreshingly and warmly, caringly honest with them. So people weren't aggressive about the things that they were doing. They'd say, well, actually you do talk too loudly when you're speaking to me. Your voice is too loud, for example. But I understand that that's how you show up when you're excited. But I care about you, and I want you to know that actually this is how you're landing and you're coming across. And I just think if more of us were brave enough to go and do that, I think we'd get a rich amount of perspective that we're not currently getting from people. A little bit of bravery. It's not just sharing things in a more compassionate way, it's also asking about how we're landing. And I think that's the bit where we start to understand our own impact and how closely that needs our own intent. And I think if we're asking the people that we're working with to do that, we should be willing to do that ourselves, and build this rich picture, because we are part of this system. We're not just individuals coming in and speaking to other individuals. We have to see how we're contributing to that environment, that system, that whole. And the only way that we really do that is by asking.
Was there a way that that these people were able to ask that made it easy for people to tell them without sort of fear of hurting their feelings, or all the things that stop me being honest with someone at work? How do you overcome that?
So they would say things. I can't remember. Before I try and bullshit my way through an answer.
You can say that, and now you can bullshit your way through an answer, having caveated that this is bullshit. We can otherwise put it in the show notes.
This is possibly a bullshit answer, but I think they did things like, saying, I'd really value your honest opinion. I really value your perspective. I really appreciate your insight into this. But yeah, I can't tell you that definitively, because I don't know how much of that is me remembering it versus me thinking what I would say in that situation.
Feels like great advice, even if it wasn't what they actually did. It sounds like it was really helpful.
I need to go and dig out the study and give you what they actually said.
Wonderful. In which case, let's draw it to a close and let you go and dig out that study and find out the actual answer. Ceri, thank you for coming on the Intelligent Teams podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. That was great fun. Thanks, Daniel. Despite the bullshit.